then they must be heretics. Because we know what the cleansing is, and it's 1844. And then we start to fight between two groups of people, both of which have a piece of the truth.
Yeah.
And each one thinks, my piece of the truth must destroy your piece of the truth, because your piece of the truth is not truth.
Christ had to face that too.
So that concern.
Yeah.
Would that be now concurring also to what Desmond Ford said, that prophecy has multiple fulfillment, which is a charismatic principle, as you have said a while ago?
Yeah, yeah.
So meaning to say, he was not at all wrong when he said there are multiple fulfillment of prophecy.
The way I would put it is this. I wouldn't say he was not at all wrong. I would say he was not all wrong. There might have been some wrong in what he was saying, and there might be some wrong in what I'm saying. But my point is that there was some right in what he was saying also. But he was so caught up, and I don't want to judge Ford, I'm just commenting from my perspective, but he was so caught up in emphasizing what he had now discovered that he might have spoken as though what we always knew was not any longer legitimate. At least he might have given that impression, hence calling down upon himself the wrath of the church. You see? Yes.
I think related to that, yeah, he said that there was nothing in heaven that happened in 1844. It was just a movement on earth. And it was, you know, a lot of things that he said that he was for were good, and what he was against were wrong.
Exactly.
And but you know, he also, another key was the Antiochus Epiphanes part, and that's where he developed his apotelesmatic principle, is because he said Antiochus Epiphanes was a little horn, and then you get maybe another little horn, and that. And so I think that there's a lot of truth, as you're saying, but there also need, you can't just say, add his to what the Daniel Revelation Committee came up with, and you've got a more holistic view. You have to weed out some of the things there.
So he probably was wrong on a number of things. But there was a cleansing here in terms of the ancient temple that Haggai talked about. And there was a cleansing here in that Christ is the blood that cleanses.
Yeah.
And to go back to Ford now with connection with this, the concept of Ford and others in that camp is to emphasize the fact, from their perspective, that when Christ ascended to minister his blood, he went straight into the most holy place. And since he did most holy place ministry from here, then there is no need for a message about most holy place here, which is what you were talking about, Christ moving from one apartment to the other.
Right.
So we don't want to get into all those details because that's not the purpose of the class, but I think it's important to be aware that this traditional chart of 2,300 days already has within it the concept of multiple cleansing of the sanctuary. But all these cleansings are on the way to this one. And this one is on the way to others, which illustrates the very principle of what I've been doing in this class of saying, let's get a bigger model. Let's not just take one aspect of the truth and focus on it so much that when we hear another truth, we can't recognize it as truth because it's not what we were focusing on. That's what gets us into trouble.
So what I get in what you're, I don't have any problem with that. I agree with what you said there 100%. Because it comprises the whole of the picture. But the main event in that prophecy is 1844. If I would use that word main event.
The event,
the main for
One of them.
the event that we have emphasized as Adventists because of what God called us to preach at our time in history is 1844. We don't want to say that in such a way as it seems to minimize what happened on the cross of Calvary, as though that's not a main event too. But this is the main event that has been central to Adventist theology, because this is the time in which God raised up the Adventist church to preach this additional insight that builds on the other main event.
Present truth.
Yeah. So we're not saying the cross was not a main event, you see. And that's why I'm telling us we have to be very careful with how we choose our words, you see. So you don't want to necessarily say 1844 was the main event, because the critic will say, aha, there, that's exactly why you Adventists are wrong. You make 1844 into the main event. And therefore you're missing the centrality of the cross of Christ. That's part of the argument Ford would give also. And it's, as far as that is concerned, he's right. If we have made 1844 more important than the cross, then we need a little bit more balance. But by the same token, if we think that emphasizing the cross means that we can dispense with 1844, that's also a problem.
Yeah.
Because 1844 is also the main event in the sense that, see, I like to use expressions like that. It's the main event in the sense that this is the point of the whole prophecy. Unto 2,300 days,
Yeah.
then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. In that sense, it's the end point of this prophecy. But that doesn't discount the fact that cross at the end of 70 weeks is also main event in another sense. Okay? Now, having said all that, we can go now back to the question of how do we talk about the real significance now spiritually of 1844, having established the legitimacy of all this historical calculation. Let's look at that for a few moments. All right. Now, one of the interesting things about the history of these discussions within Adventism is that we have tended to reflect the traditional interpretation, which I believe is the correct interpretation, but we have tended to reflect the traditional interpretation simply because of our commitment to the tradition, not because we understand what we're talking about.
That's right.
You know? So, I'm an Adventist, so I believe in 1844. Well, what's the significance of 1844? Well, I'm not quite sure. But Ellen White supports it, so it must be right. And you know, I grew up teaching it, so it must be right. And so you're asking a significant question, Basilio, that helps us now to shake out of that. It's not enough to know that 1844 is right. We must be able to break it down to someone who can't even calculate the 2,300 days and explain to them the spiritual gospel significance of why is this so important? Why is a heavenly judgment that we don't even know when our names will come up, why is it important to preach that? What's the significance there? You know? And if we pay attention to it and if we reflect on it, it will become obvious to us. But there is a danger that we might just say, oh, I believe it, I'm an Adventist, I believe it, and then we move on. We don't really think about what it is that we're believing. So this question is very relevant. And as a result of that carelessness, one of the things that happens to us is that we forget what our pioneers already discovered about the significance of that. We still defend what they taught, but we forget why they taught it and what the spiritual significance of it was. But when we begin to ask this question now, and we go back and we reread what our Adventist position is, then we rediscover how wonderful and how much good news it is, this truth about the investigative judgment that began in 1844. So I want to start to answer your question by going back and reminding you of some of our traditional teaching on this subject, which you know already, but maybe we have forgotten how significant and interesting this teaching is. So here we go. The Adventist position on 1844 includes the concept that in 1844 the judgment began with those who are sleeping. Remember that?
Investigative judgment.
Investigative judgment didn't begin with the judgment of the living, but the judgment beginning in 1844 began with those who are sleeping, beginning with Adam, and that at some point after 1844, the judgment will transition to a judgment of those who are living. And at the end of the judgment of those who are living, there will be a close of probation. For those who are living. Now that's just a simple summary of the traditional framework that Adventists have developed about what really happened beginning in 1844. But the average Adventist today doesn't even remember that that's what we really believe about the post-1844 dynamics of the judgment. We just defend, oh, judgment, cleansing, and sanctuary began in 1844. But we've forgotten that there is a complex conception here about what is involved in that process. And so we need to ask ourselves, why does God begin with the judgment of the dead? And why does he then transition at some point, yet unknown, to the judgment of the living? What is the significance of this Adventist traditional interpretation of how judgment develops after 1844? And those questions have been largely forgotten among us. They're not even frequently preached anymore among us. Most of the times when we preach on 1844, all we're doing is preaching to prove that 1844 is doctrinal. You know, yes, if you believe in 1844, you're good Adventist. If you question it, you're a bad Adventist. But nobody talks about this anymore, which is really the significance of 1844. Because our message is not so much about what happened at the moment when the clock struck midnight on October 22, 1844. Our message is about what began to be happening then and continues to happen until the close of probation. And what is it that we teach began to happen then? The judgment of the dead, which will one day pass to the judgment of the living. So here's my question now, as we wrestle with the issue that you ask us to focus on, Basilio. Why does God begin with the judgment of the dead at this point? And why does he transition to the judgment of the living at some future point? The date of which we don't know. And as I wrestle with that, I reflect on the text that says, "It is appointed unto men once to die, and after death the judgment." It is appointed unto men once to die, and after death the judgment. How is it then that God will at some point in time decide to break that rule and judge people while they're living? Interesting theological questions come up once you get free of just defending 1844 and start to ask real theological questions about why do we teach what we teach. So that to me is an important question here. It's appointed unto men once to die, and after death to judgment. So why does God begin with judging dead persons and then one day transition to judging living persons? We need a theological, biblical explanation of that. Second question that may even be preliminary to that question is, if it is appointed unto men once to die, and after death the judgment, why does God delay the judgment of Adam until 1844? You know, he could have judged Adam after his death a long time ago. Why does he delay the judgment of even the dead who have died all through history until this moment in time? Interesting questions, right? Now, I'm not suggesting that I have the final perfect answer to these questions, but I'm showing you that when you begin to ask these questions, you open yourself up for now a whole new Bible study process, a whole new research project to try to uncover what the answers to these questions might be. I have some suggestions, but I'm not suggesting that when I have given you my answer, that's the final word. Just a thought I have on this that needs to be further discussed and studied for the rest of our experience in the world as Adventists. We can keep digging into these things. But if we waste our time arguing about whether 1844 is the truth or not, we'll never get to this. That's the tragedy of the fall crisis. All right? So, here's my theory. The judgment, beginning in 1844, as I implied earlier, is an investigative judgment taking place in heaven, and part of its significance is that it is for the benefit of the heavenly intelligences. You see? But something about the process of history needed to happen before even the heavenly intelligences would be ready to evaluate God's righteousness in judging the wicked. Some certain amount of history will have to pass before the heavenly intelligences had been given enough information from the historical process so that they were now ready to participate with God in the investigative judgment. Now that's worth further investigation to see what support we could give for that, but that's my thesis. Now notice how my theological process works. I accept what the Bible teaches about 1844. I accept what the Adventist Church teaches about the judgment of the dead and the judgment of the living, even if I don't fully understand it yet. And then, having accepted what has been revealed, I say, now why is that like that? And then it becomes very obvious that the answer may be the historical process prior to 1844 was necessary to have taken place in preparation for the heavenly intelligences being qualified to judge those who have already died. That doesn't answer all the questions, but it gives us a possible suggestion as to why there would be a delay in the judgment. Does that make any sense to you?
Yes, yes.
See? And I'm not presenting that dogmatically as I can give you a proof text to prove it. It's just a thesis, a proposition, given what the Bible has already told us about the delay of the judgment until then. This might be a reason. And then you can go and study the Bible and study the spirit process to try to see if there's evidence in the Bible that that's a legitimate way. And I think there is.
Ellen White gives credibility to the idea that the unfallen angels didn't really have complete sealed loyalty in time that went on, even though they're loyal. It wasn't completely settled for them until then.
Yes. So
until the cross. So there's 4,000 years of
the cross would be one of those major events that would prepare them for this judgment. But even the cross did not immediately usher in what we call the investigative judgment. So apparently there's something after the cross that also needs to happen in the progress of history until this time is ready. And I'm not going to spend much more time trying to defend that. I just wanted to expose you to that suggestion for further reflection and thought. Now let's go further. So, since the judgment is for the heavenly intelligences, and since somehow God has now prepared the heavenly intelligences by the cross of Christ and the subsequent history to be ready to judge those who are dead, the next question is, why does he not immediately go to the judgment of the living? You see? Why does God not immediately go to the judgment of the living? Here's my suggestion. Let's go back to the concept of it's appointed unto men once to die, and after death the judgment. Let me try to understand that first before I wrestle with the question of how can God judge the living? So my question first is, why does God wait until people die to judge them? And here is my answer. God does not rush to judgment. Which is why he delayed judgment till 1844 in the first place, even for the heavenly beings. But now, God does not rush to judgment in terms of individual living beings. You see? He gives the person an entire lifetime before he judges. He says, I'll judge you at the end. I'm God. I know the end from the beginning. I even know how you're going to turn out in the end. But I will not conduct your judgment until the end of your life. Why? Not because I have to wait, but because the judgment is not for me. Judgment is for others who don't understand what I understand. And I have to show myself to be just. So I'm not going to rush to the judgment and pronounce the final word on your life until after your death, when everybody else who is looking at the judgment can see why I judge the way I do.
It's not a martial court.
Yes, not a court-martial. After death, the judgment, because the intelligences of the universe are looking at the whole life of Pastor Hanna, and God is saying, this is why I'm going to bring him into my kingdom. Or this is why I can't take the risk of bringing Pastor Hanna into the kingdom. And the intelligences in heaven will be able to look at the life of the person and say, God is just. So God does not rush to judgment. God does not judge before the time. And the principle of judgment is, it's appointed unto men once to die, and after death, the judgment. But I still now have the problem. Why is he going to make an exception for those who are living? And here is my thesis for that I've now prepared you for through such a long process. My thesis at the end is this. There's going to come a time in the final generation when, because of the maturation of the righteousness of those who are in Christ, and the maturation of the wickedness of those who are not in Christ, that the time of judgment will come prior to literal death. Because persons have been so settled into the truth that God can judge them while they're living and it won't be premature. And persons will be so settled into the rebellion against the truth that God can judge them while they're living and it will not be premature.
Like the days of Noah.
Exactly. But there are special circumstances in which that is possible to be happening. The regular run-of-the-mill thing is you wait until death. But there's special moments in history, and especially at the end of history here, when situations will have developed in such a way that a living generation of Christians and sinners have so matured in their faith or in their unbelief that it is as though they were already dead, because there's no more hope for them to change from one side to the other. Their probation is closed, as it were, and so they are ready for judgment. Now, this is a little complicated idea. It might be new, so stay with me. We usually think of the close of probation as something that happens at one moment here. But the fact of the matter is that probation closes over a span of time, one person at a time. Each person's probation closes when that person becomes so settled into truth that he cannot change sides anymore, or so settled into rebellion that he or she cannot change sides anymore. At that moment, that person's probation closes, and at that moment, that person comes into judgment. Now, this is a little different from what we have presented it as before. And this is one of the reasons why young people are terrified of the investigative judgment. Because they have this idea that I'm just going along as a Christian, my probation isn't closed yet, and I have a good chance of repenting tomorrow, and then God just happens to arbitrarily come upon my name, and it has nothing to do with where I am personally, but my name came up. And so God says, I wish I could give you some more time, Pastor Hanna, but your name came up. You reached the H's, your name came up.
Let's
so
see where are you?
we have to cut you off now. Your time has run out. And when we present the judgment that way, we give a wrong picture of God. We give the picture of a God who judges me before my time. And we say, why? I wish I had a couple more days. But God will never do that.
Heavenly bureaucracy.
God will never judge you before your time.
Peter agrees very
Yes.
strongly in 2 Peter 3, 9, 10. He's talking about God is not slack concerning his promise, but he's patient.
Yes.
No.
Willing that all should come to repentance.
Right.
God will not judge one single person if that person was still in a position where they could, from God's perspective, be saved. He judges them when they are beyond salvation. And his probation is not an arbitrary closing of probation because he happens to have come to your name. The closing of probation is integrally tied into your personal relationship with God and your development of character. Now,
But
this
he knows
puts-
that already,
Yeah.
but it's only for the angels.
Yes, and this puts a whole new spin on the judgment teaching that makes it good news. In other words, it is good news when God comes to my name. It's not bad news. You see? If I am a Christian and I'm walking with Christ and God comes to my name, it's because he has concluded that I'm saved, sealed, sanctified, filled with the Holy Ghost, settled for heaven. And he says, okay, let's judge that one now. You see? And if I am a rebel against God and he comes to my name, I can't complain either, because I have rebelled against him so consistently that I have hardened myself in sin, I have seared my conscience, and there's no more chance that I will repent anyhow, so why am I complaining that he's decided to judge me? You see? Now, I don't know when I have crossed that line, but God knows, and I can trust God that he will not rush my case to judgment, but he will judge me at the right time, which will give me the maximum opportunity to receive the gospel of Jesus Christ. Let me just dramatize this a little bit more, then I'll sit and have your questions and discussion. Here's my point. How does God decide which name comes up next? Does he decide it alphabetically? You know? We're in the H's now, Pastor Hanna, so you better, take things seriously. Would that be fair if God judged us alphabetically? When we went to review the judgment during the 1,000 years, would we agree that God was fair? Would we not say, no, God, you can't go by H's, because there's some people whose names start with A who don't have as much light as Dr. Hanna, whose name starts with H. And you already judged that fellow whose name starts with A 15 years ago. Well, how come you judge him first when he didn't even have all the light that Dr. Hanna had? So to go alphabetically would not be fair. God would not be able to be just in the judgment if that's how he decided whose name came up next. Well, does he go chronologically? Does he say, well, I'll start with the older people, and then after a while I'll move to the younger people, and maybe that's fair? No, that will not be fair either, because there are some young people who had more light than some older people. And God has to be fair in the judgment.
Yeah.
You see? So I'm suggesting that God does not use any of those mechanisms that humans would use to decide whose name is ready to come up in the judgment. He doesn't go alphabetically, he doesn't go chronologically. He, in his wisdom, does it in such a way that when the review judgment is done, and those who are saved go to heaven, and they look over God's shoulder and see how he did it, and why he did it, and when he decided to judge this one and that one, we will all say, that was fair. Now, we don't know exactly how God does that, because we're not God. But we will know then that God is fair and God is just. And when you present the judgment that way, then it's not a terror. And again, we have almost intentionally sometimes presented it as a terror because we thought that was the way to motivate our people to live right.
Repent!
Hellfire.
Vegetarian hellfire.
If you know your name might come up tonight, then maybe you'll do well, you know. But the thing is, that's not the way it works. You see? And so instead of giving us a positive picture of God, it gives us a negative picture of God. That he's up there just saying, okay, I think I feel like judging Pastor Hanna today, so, you know, ready or not, here I come. And then this matter of, is my name coming up tonight, becomes a kind of terrifying thing. You see? So again, I'm not wanting to be dogmatic here and say this is the only way to explain it. But this is one of the ways I've wrestled with this question of why has God led Adventists into this kind of model for the development of the judgment since 1844. And it seems to me that part of the answer might be that we learn from this picture that God does not rush to judgment. Number one, he has delayed the judgment even of the dead because he wanted the whole universe to be ready for that judgment. And then number two, he delays the judgment of the living because he's long-suffering, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance, and he will not judge anyone until there is no more time left for that person, because they have consented into the truth or not. So God's judgment in the investigative judgment is not what closes your probation. This is maybe a little different from the way we've preached it. It is not God who says, okay, I'm fed up now, I'm ready to close things up, so I'm going to choose your name, Ovidiu, and then I'm going to turn off your probation. No, God is investigating your case and pointing out to the heavenly intelligences that your probation has now closed because of the path you have chosen. And he pronounces the judgment based on what you have been experiencing in accepting or rejecting truth. So he's not the one turning off the probation. He's the one simply investigating in the sight of the heavenly intelligences what you have done in your relationship with Christ. Yes?
I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think